The cave smelled like smoke and death, and Lyria covered her nose as she stepped carefully over broken rocks and scattered bones, and she had tracked the crying sounds for 2 hours through the dense forest. And now she stood at the entrance to the dark hollow, wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. She was an elf woman who lived in the village of Silverwood, where ancient trees grew so tall they touched the clouds, and her people had lived there for thousands of years following old rules and old wisdom. And one of the oldest rules was simple and clear and absolute, which was to never trust dragons. Dragons were apex predators who could burn entire forests with their breath and crush stone with their jaws, and they hunted elves and deer and anything else that moved through their territory. And the village elders told stories about the great dragon wars when Lyria's ancestors had fought for survival against the flying beasts. But the sound coming from inside the cave was not the roar of a monster, and it was the desperate crying of babies who were scared and alone and hungry. And Lyria had heard that same sound once before when she found an abandoned fox kit in the woods, and she could not walk away then, and she could not walk away now. She lit a small torch and moved deeper into the cave, and the crying grew louder and more frantic, and then she saw them huddled together in a corner, and 3 dragon hatchlings no bigger than rabbits with scales that shimmered blue and silver in the firelight, and their eyes were wide with fear, and their tiny wings trembled as they pressed against each other. Lyria knelt down slowly and spoke in a soft voice and told them she would not hurt them. And the smallest hatchling tilted its head and made a questioning chirp, and then all 3 rushed toward her and climbed onto her lap and tangled themselves in her cloak. And their bodies were warm, and their scales were smooth, and they smelled like cinnamon and smoke. She looked around the cave and saw the reason for their distress, and their mother lay dead near the back wall, and her body was covered in arrows and spear wounds, and Lyria recognized the weapons because they belonged to the hunting parties from her own village, and they had killed this dragon 2 days ago and celebrated their victory with songs and wine. But nobody had checked if the dragon had babies, and nobody had cared enough to look. And now these 3 orphans were starving and alone, and they would die within days if someone did not help them. And Lyria felt anger rise in her chest because this was not justice, and this was not protection, and this was just cruelty disguised as safety. She gathered the hatchlings carefully and wrapped them in her cloak, and they settled against her warmth and stopped crying. And she carried them out of the cave and back through the forest toward Silverwood, and the whole journey she rehearsed what she would say to the elders and how she would convince them to let her care for these babies. But when she reached the village and showed the hatchlings to the council, and the reaction was immediate and harsh, and Elder Theron stood up and shouted that she had brought death into their home, and Elder Seren said dragons could never be trusted, no matter how small, and Elder Kale demanded she return them to the forest immediately. Lyria argued that they were innocent children who had done nothing wrong, and that abandoning them was murder, and that the elves were supposed to be wise and compassionate and not ruled by ancient fear and prejudice. And she said her people had a duty to fix the harm they had caused by killing the mother. But the council would not listen, and they said the old laws existed for good reasons, and that predators belonged in the wild, and that keeping dragons was dangerous and foolish, and they gave her until sunrise to remove the hatchlings from the village or face exile herself, and the other elves nodded in agreement because fear was easier than change. Lyria left the council hall with the sleeping hatchlings still wrapped in her cloak, and she felt more alone than ever before, and she walked to the edge of the village where the great trees gave way to open meadows, and she sat down in the grass and cried because she did not know what to do. She could not abandon the babies to die, and she could not keep them in a village that wanted them dead, and she could not raise 3 dragons by herself because she did not know how to hunt for them or teach them or protect them from the world, and she felt trapped between her heart and her home. The hatchlings woke up and chirped softly and nuzzled against her hands, and the smallest one looked up at her with bright golden eyes that held complete trust and love. And Lyria realized that these creatures had already chosen her as their family, and she could not betray that trust, no matter what it cost her. She made her decision. Then and gathered her few belongings and walked away from Silverwood and into the forest, and she would find a way to care for these dragons even if she had to do it alone, and even if her people never forgave her, and even if the world thought she was crazy because some things were more important than safety, And more important than tradition and protecting innocent lives was one of those things. She traveled for hours until she found a clearing far from the village, and there she made a simple camp with a fire and shelter, and the hatchlings explored their new home with curious eyes and playful jumps, and they seemed happy despite everything, and that made Lyria smile, even though her heart was heavy with loss. As night fell, she fed them small pieces of dried meat from her pack, and they ate hungrily and then curled up beside the fire and fell asleep. And Lyria watched them breathe, and wondered what would happen next, and how she would survive, and whether she had made the right choice. She did not know that in the morning everything would change, and that help would come from the most unexpected place, and that 3 strangers would walk into her clearing and offer her something her own people had refused to give, and that something was hope and partnership, and the belief that protecting the vulnerable was always worth the risk. Morning came with golden sunlight streaming through the trees, and Lyria woke to find the 3 hatchlings already awake and chirping excitedly at something beyond the clearing, and she sat up quickly and reached for her bow, and then she saw what had captured their attention. 3 humans stood at the edge of the forest watching her camp with curious expressions, and they wore simple traveling clothes and carried packs on their backs, and they did not look like soldiers or hunters, and the woman in front had kind brown eyes and a gentle smile that somehow made Lyria feel less afraid. The woman raised her hands to show she meant no harm, and she spoke in the common tongue that traders used, and her voice was warm and friendly, and she said her name was Maya Rodriguez, and she asked if Lyria needed any help, because they had heard dragon cries in the night, and wanted to make sure everything was all right. Lyria stood slowly, and positioned herself between the humans and the hatchlings, and she explained that she was caring for orphaned dragons and that her village had rejected them, and that she would protect these babies with her life if necessary, and her hand stayed near her bow because trust did not come easily anymore. Maya nodded and said she understood, and then she did something unexpected, and she knelt down on the ground and made herself small and non-threatening, and she held out her hand toward the hatchlings and made soft clicking sounds with her tongue and waited patiently. The smallest hatchling tilted its head and watched Maya for a long moment, and then it chirped and scampered forward and sniffed her fingers carefully, and its tail wagged like a happy puppy. And then it climbed into Maya's lap and nuzzled against her shirt and made contented humming sounds. The other 2 hatchlings saw their sibling getting attention and immediately rushed over and climbed on Maya too, and they tangled themselves around her arms and chirped for pets, and Maya laughed and stroked their scales and said they were beautiful, and her companions smiled at the sight. The man with red hair and freckles introduced himself as Colin Burke, and he sat down cross-legged and let one of the hatchlings explore his pack, and the creature pulled out a piece of rope and started playing with it like a cat with string. And Colin grinned and said his sister had raised wolves back home, and these dragons reminded him of wolf puppies. The other woman had black hair and sharp eyes, and she said her name was Amy Chen, and she was a scientist who studied animal behavior. And she pulled out a journal and started sketching the hatchlings and taking notes. And she asked Lyria questions about their age and diet and temperament. Lyria watched in amazement as these strangers interacted with the dragons without any fear, and her own people would not even look at the babies without flinching. But these humans treated them like normal animals who deserved kindness and respect, and she felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Maya looked up at Lyria and asked what her plan was and whether she had enough food and shelter and if she knew how to care for growing dragons. And her tone was not judgmental but genuinely concerned. And Lyria felt tears sting her eyes because nobody had asked her these questions before. She admitted that she did not have a real plan, and that she was making everything up as she went along, and that she was scared and alone, and had no idea if she could actually keep these babies alive and healthy and safe, and saying it out loud made her feel both vulnerable and relieved. Colin stood up and walked around the clearing and examined her simple shelter and the small fire pit and her meager supplies, and then he looked at Maya and Amy, and they seemed to have a silent conversation. And then he turned to Lyria and said they would help her if she wanted. Lyria stared at them in confusion and asked why they would risk helping her raise dragons when they just met, and when they had no connection to her or her problems. And Maya smiled and said that where they came from, humans believed that protecting innocent lives was always the right thing to do, regardless of species or circumstance. Amy added that they had been traveling through this region studying local wildlife and learning about different cultures, and helping someone in need was more important than their research schedule. And besides, she said studying dragon development from infancy would be an incredible opportunity that might never come again. Colin said his people had learned long ago that predators were not evil just because they hunted, and that even fierce creatures could form deep bonds with those who showed them kindness and patience, and he believed these hatchlings deserved a chance at life, just like any other orphaned animal. Lyria felt overwhelmed by their generosity, and she asked what they would want in return because nothing in life was free and there was always a price, and Maya shook her head and said the only thing they wanted was to know the hatchlings would survive and thrive, and that was payment enough. The elf woman looked at the 3 dragons playing with the humans and saw how happy they seemed, and how the humans moved carefully around them and spoke to them with respect. And she realized that maybe she had been wrong about humans, and maybe there was more to them than the story suggested. She agreed to accept their help, and Maya immediately started organizing the camp, and Colin began gathering materials to build a better shelter, and Amy sat with the hatchlings and observed their behavior, and made detailed notes, and everyone worked together, like they had been a team for years. By afternoon, Colin had built a sturdy shelter large enough for all of them, and Maya had hunted fresh game and was teaching the hatchlings to eat raw meat, and Amy had created a feeding schedule and exercise plan, based on her observations, and Lyria felt useful for the first time since leaving her village. The humans shared their food with her, and told stories about their homeland, and explained how they trained animals using positive reinforcement instead of punishment, and they showed her techniques that her people had never considered, and she absorbed everything eagerly. As evening fell, they sat around the fire, and the hatchlings curled up in a pile between them. And Maya said that tomorrow they would start proper training, and Colin said he would build a larger enclosure for when the dragons got bigger, and Amy said she would document everything, so others could learn from their experience. Lyria looked at her new companions, and felt gratitude wash over her, and she had been prepared to face this challenge alone, but now she had partners who believed in the same things she did, and who were willing to fight for creatures that most people feared and rejected. She asked them how humans had become so accepting of predators, and Maya explained that her people had once been afraid too, but they learned that fear led to cruelty, and cruelty led to emptiness, and that choosing compassion was harder, but always more rewarding, and created a better world for everyone. That night, Lyria slept peacefully for the first time since finding the hatchlings, and she dreamed of a future where dragons and elves and humans all lived together, and where fear was replaced with understanding, and where protecting the vulnerable was celebrated instead of punished. And when she woke, she believed that future might actually be possible. 2 weeks passed, and the clearing transformed into a proper home, and Colin had built multiple structures, including sleeping quarters and storage areas, and a training ground where the hatchlings could practice flying and hunting, and the whole camp felt permanent and safe and full of purpose. The dragons had grown noticeably larger, and they were now the size of medium dogs with stronger wings and sharper claws, and their scales had deepened in color, and they could breathe small puffs of fire when excited or scared, and Maya said this was normal development and right on schedule. Each dragon had developed a distinct personality, and the smallest one, who Lyria named Storm, was curious and gentle, and loved to curl up on people's laps, and the middle one, called Ember, was bold and playful, and always led the others into mischief, and the largest, named Sky, was thoughtful and protective, and watched over his siblings constantly. Maya had created a training program based on how humans worked with intelligent animals back home, and she used patience and rewards instead of force and punishment, and the dragons responded beautifully, and they learned to come when called, and to wait for permission before eating, and to control their fire breath. Colin discovered he had a natural gift for understanding what the dragons needed, and he could tell when one was feeling sick just by watching how it moved, and when another needed more exercise or mental stimulation, and the dragons trusted him completely, and followed him around like ducklings following their mother. Amy documented everything in her journal, and she recorded their growth measurements and behavioral patterns and training progress, and she said this information could help change how people viewed dragons and prove that even apex predators could be intelligent companions rather than mindless monsters. Lyria learned more in those 2 weeks than she had in years, living in Silverwood, and the humans taught her about animal psychology and positive reinforcement and how to read body language and subtle signals, and she realized her people had never tried to understand dragons and had only feared them. One morning, a young elf scout from Silverwood approached the camp nervously, and his name was Finn, and he had been sent by Elder Seren to check if Lyria was still alive, and he stared in shock as he watched the three dragons playing fetch with Colin and responding to Maya's hand signals. Finn could not believe what he was seeing because everything he had been taught said dragons were savage and uncontrollable. But these creatures were gentle and obedient and clearly bonded to their caretakers. And he asked Lyria how this was possible, and she smiled and said humans had shown her a different way. She invited Finn to stay and watch, and Maya demonstrated the training techniques and let him interact with Storm, who nuzzled his hand and made happy chirping sounds. And Finn laughed with delight and said he had never imagined dragons could be like this, and he asked if he could visit again. Lyria told him he was welcome any time, and that she hoped he would share what he learned with the village, and Finn promised he would. And when he left, he kept looking back at the dragons with wonder in his eyes, and Maya said, that was how change began, with one person at a time, seeing the truth. More elves started visiting after Finn spread the word, and they came cautiously at first. But their fear melted away when they saw the dragons playing and training and responding to commands, and some admitted they had been wrong to demand the babies be abandoned, and they asked if they could learn the human training methods. Maya and Colin and Amy welcomed everyone who came with genuine curiosity, and they patiently explained their techniques and philosophy, and they emphasized that the key was treating the dragons with respect and understanding rather than domination and fear, and many elves began questioning other old beliefs they had never examined. Elder Seren herself eventually came to the camp, and she was a proud woman who rarely admitted mistakes, but she watched the dragons for a long time, and then she approached Lyria and said she had been wrong, and that the village should have supported her instead of threatening exile. She asked the humans why they had been willing to help when Lyria's own people had turned away, and Maya explained that humans believed strongly in protecting those who could not protect themselves, and that they had learned through hard experience that abandoning the vulnerable only created more suffering, and solving problems with compassion was always better than solving them with fear. Colin added that his people had made many mistakes throughout their history and had caused terrible harm when they let fear guide their decisions. But they had also learned to recognize those mistakes and change course, and that ability to admit being wrong and choose differently was what made civilization advance. Amy said that scientific observation showed clearly that dragons were highly intelligent and social creatures who formed strong family bonds, and that treating them as mindless monsters was not only cruel, but factually incorrect, and that education and understanding were the cure for prejudice. Elder Seren listened carefully, and then she made an announcement that shocked everyone, and she said Silverwood would officially support the Dragon Sanctuary and provide resources and protection, and she invited Lyria to return to the village with the dragons and teach others what she had learned. Lyria looked at Maya and Colin and Amy and asked what they thought, and Maya said the decision was hers to make, but that spreading knowledge and changing minds was important work, and the humans would continue helping as long as they were needed. They decided together that some would return to Silverwood, while others maintained the forest camp, and they would create a network of safe spaces where orphaned predators could be rehabilitated, and where people could learn that coexistence was possible and preferable to endless conflict. The dragons themselves seemed to sense the importance of what was happening, and they behaved perfectly during Elder Seren's visit, and Storm even brought her a flower he had picked and placed it at her feet, and the old elf woman smiled and stroked his scales and said maybe the young ones were wiser than their elders. As preparations began for the move back to Silverwood, Lyria reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks, and she had gone from being alone and desperate to being part of a team with a real mission and purpose, and she had learned that sometimes strangers could become family, and that doing the right thing eventually attracted others who believed the same. That evening they celebrated around the fire, and the dragons performed tricks they had learned, and everyone laughed and shared food and stories, and Maya said this was what the future should look like, with different species and cultures working together and choosing understanding over fear and building something better than what came before. Colin raised his cup and made a toast to new beginnings and to the courage it took to challenge old beliefs, and to the three little dragons who had brought everyone together, and to the humans and elves who had chosen compassion. And everyone cheered, and the dragons roared tiny roars and shot sparks into the night sky. Lyria felt happier than she could remember, and she realized that saving the dragons had also saved her, and had given her purpose and friends and hope for a different kind of future. And she knew that whatever challenges came next, they would face them together, and that made all the difference. 3 months had passed since Lyria returned to Silverwood with the dragons, and the village had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. And where there had once been fear, there was now curiosity, and where there had been rejection, there was now acceptance, and the change had happened slowly but surely, like water wearing down stone. The dragons were now the size of horses with powerful wings that could carry them high into the sky, and their scales gleamed in the sunlight, and their fire breath was hot enough to melt metal. But they remained gentle with their chosen family, and they had never harmed anyone, despite having the power to cause terrible destruction. Storm had become the village favorite because of his sweet temperament, and he loved children, and let them climb on his back and ride around the square, and parents who had once kept their kids away now brought them for visits, and the children learned early that dragons were friends, not monsters. Ember was the most energetic, and she helped the hunters by spotting game from above and driving animals toward waiting groups, and she never took kills for herself without permission, and the hunters who had once killed her mother now worked alongside her, and some admitted they felt shame for what they had done. Sky was the natural leader, and he patrolled the forest borders and warned of approaching danger, and he had already saved the village twice by alerting them to forest fires before they spread, and the elves began to see him as a guardian rather than a threat, and they left offerings of food and thanks. Maya and Colin and Amy had stayed in Silverwood to help establish the sanctuary properly, and they trained dozens of elves in their methods. And the sanctuary had grown to house not just dragons but also orphaned wolves and bears and mountain cats and other predators that people usually feared and killed. The humans taught that every creature had value and deserved respect, and that predators played important roles in keeping nature balanced, and that killing them out of fear created more problems than it solved. And many elves began questioning other traditions they had never examined before. Word of the sanctuary spread to other communities, and visitors came from distant lands to see the dragons and learn the training methods. And some brought their own orphaned animals, and some brought questions about how to live alongside predators instead of fighting them constantly. Delegation of dwarves arrived from the mountain kingdoms, and they were skeptical at first because dwarves and dragons had been enemies for centuries, and dragons had destroyed many dwarf settlements and killed many miners. But they agreed to watch and learn before making judgments. The dwarf leader was named Kara Ironforge, and she was a tough woman with braided beard and scarred hands, and she watched Storm play with elf children, and she watched Ember hunt cooperatively with the elves, and she watched Sky guard the village, and her expression remained neutral and unreadable. Maya invited Kara to meet the dragons personally, and Kara approached cautiously with her hand on her axe, and Storm tilted his head and studied her. And then he did something unexpected, and he bowed low and pressed his nose to the ground in a gesture of respect and submission. Kara was shocked, because dragons never showed submission, and she asked why he would bow to her. And Maya explained that the dragons had learned that respect was earned through actions not demanded through fear, and that Storm recognized Kara as someone deserving honor. The dwarf woman slowly reached out and touched Storm's scales, and he hummed contentedly and leaned into her hand, and Kara's eyes filled with tears, and she said her daughter had been killed by a wild dragon 10 years ago, and she had hated all dragons since then, but this one was different, and she did not know how to feel. Colin sat beside Kara and spoke gently, and he said that grief and anger were natural and valid, but that holding on to hate only poisoned the person carrying it, and that these dragons were not responsible for what others had done, and judging all members of a species by the actions of a few was the root of endless conflict. And he added that wild dragons and trained dragons were as different as wild wolves and domestic dogs, and that environment and upbringing shaped behavior just as much as instinct, and that these three had been raised with love and structure and clear boundaries, and that made all the difference. Kara spent 3 days at the sanctuary, and she worked with the dragons and helped feed them and watched them interact with the community. And on the last day, she announced that she would establish a similar program in the Mountain Kingdoms, and she asked Maya and Colin and Amy if they would come help. The humans agreed, and they began planning an expedition to the Dwarflands, and Lyria said she would come too and bring the dragons because this was bigger than just her village. And this was about changing the world and proving that different species could live together in peace. Before they left, an unexpected visitor arrived, and it was a wild adult dragon who landed in the village square, and everyone froze in fear. But Storm and Ember and Sky rushed forward and greeted the newcomer with excited chirps and body language that showed recognition and joy. Maya realized this must be a relative of the 3 orphans and possibly their aunt or older sibling, and the wild dragon examined the 3 youngsters carefully and seemed satisfied with their health and happiness. And then she turned to look at the assembled crowd of elves and humans. The wild dragon made a deep rumbling sound that was not threatening, but seemed more like acknowledgement or approval. And then she touched her nose to Lyria's forehead and to Maya's hand and to Colin's shoulder, and everyone held their breath and waited to see what would happen next. Storm chirped and tugged at the wild dragon's wing and seemed to be showing her around and introducing her to people, and the wild dragon followed patiently and let the village children approach and sniff their hands, and she was careful not to make any sudden movements that might scare them. Elder Seren approached slowly and spoke in the old dragon tongue that few elves still remembered, and she thanked the wild dragon for trusting them with her family, and promised they would always be protected and honored, and the dragon rumbled again and nodded her massive head. The wild dragon stayed for 1 day and night, and the next morning she flew away, but not before touching noses with each of the 3 youngsters, and with Lyria and with the humans, and it was clear she was giving her blessing and permission and acceptance, and everyone understood. This was a sacred moment. Maya said later that this was proof their approach worked, and that even wild dragons could recognize the difference between those who meant harm and those who showed respect, and that building trust was always possible if people were willing to try and to change their assumptions. The village celebrated that evening, and they honored the wild dragon's visit, and they honored the 3 youngsters who had changed everything, and they honored the humans who had shown them a different path, and they honored Lyria, who had been brave enough to choose compassion over conformity. As Lyria prepared for the journey to the dwarf kingdoms, she reflected on how much her life had changed, and she had gone from being an outcast to being a teacher and leader, and she had discovered that protecting the vulnerable was not weakness, but the greatest strength, and that real courage meant standing up for what was right, even when everyone else said it was wrong. The dragons sensed they were about to begin a new adventure, and they flew circles above the village and breathed fire into the sky in celebration, and the elves cheered and the humans laughed, and everyone felt hope for the future, and believed that maybe one day all species could live together in harmony and respect. The journey to the Mountain Kingdoms took 2 weeks, and the group traveled through forests and across rivers and over hills, and the dragons flew overhead scouting the path and warning of obstacles, and their presence made the journey safer because bandits and wild beasts avoided areas where dragons patrolled. Along the way they stopped in several villages, and word of the trained dragons had spread far and wide, and people came out to see them with mixtures of fear and wonder and curiosity. And Lyria and the humans gave demonstrations and answered questions and planted seeds of change in every community they visited. One village had recently lost sheep to wild predators, and the farmers were angry and wanted to hunt down every wolf and bear in the region. And Maya asked if she could try a different approach, and they reluctantly agreed because they respected the dragon trainers and wanted to learn their methods. She explained that killing predators often made problems worse because it disrupted pack structures and territorial boundaries and left young animals without parents to teach them proper hunting, and instead she suggested they work on better fences and guard animals and learning to coexist with the wildlife. Sky volunteered to patrol the area at night, and his presence alone was enough to keep wild predators away from the livestock, and the farmers were amazed at how effective this was, and they asked if they could trade for a dragon egg someday, and Maya explained that dragons chose their companions and could not be bought or sold. When they finally reached the Mountain Kingdoms, Kara Ironforge greeted them with full honors, and hundreds of dwarves had gathered to see the legendary trained dragons. and many carried weapons and looked suspicious and hostile. And the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kara led them to a large arena carved into the mountainside, and she announced that the dragons would demonstrate their training and obedience, and that afterward, there would be a council meeting to decide if the dwarf kingdoms would pursue a similar program or continue their policy of hunting. All dragons on site Lyria felt nervous because everything they had worked for depended on this moment, and if the demonstration went badly, the dwarves might reject the whole idea and continue the ancient war between their species. And she looked at Storm and Ember and Sky and silently asked them to do their best. The dragons seemed to understand the importance of the situation, and they performed flawlessly, and they responded instantly to voice commands and hand signals, and they demonstrated controlled fire breathing and precision flying and gentle interaction with volunteers from the crowd, and every move was calculated to show intelligence and discipline. Storm allowed dwarf children to climb on his back and ride around the arena, and the children squealed with delight, and their parents watched with tears in their eyes because they had never imagined such a thing was possible. And old hatreds began to crack under the weight of new possibilities. Ember demonstrated hunting cooperation by working with dwarf hunters to track and catch game without ever competing for the kill or showing aggression. And she followed commands perfectly and shared the food generously, and the hunters admitted they had never seen such teamwork from any creature. Sky performed rescue maneuvers by locating a hidden volunteer in the mountains and carrying them to safety, and he was gentle despite his size and strength, and the dwarves who had lost family members to cave-ins and avalanches began to see how dragons could save lives instead of taking them after the demonstration. The council convened and the debate was fierce, and many older dwarves argued that dragons could never be trusted and that this was a trick or temporary behavior that would vanish once the dragons grew larger and hungrier and more wild. But younger dwarves spoke up and said they had seen the evidence with their own eyes, and that refusing to adapt and learn was cowardice, not wisdom, and that their ancestors would be ashamed if they let fear prevent progress. And the argument went back and forth for hours. Finally, an ancient dwarf named Elder Brighthammer stood up, and the whole chamber fell silent because she was over 300 years old and had fought in the Great Dragon Wars and had lost her entire family to dragonfire, and everyone waited to hear what she would say. She walked slowly to the center of the chamber and looked at Lyria and the humans and the three dragons, and her face was weathered and scarred, and her eyes held centuries of pain and loss. And when she spoke, her voice was strong and clear despite her age. She said she had spent 300 years hating dragons, and that hatred had kept her warm through cold nights and had given her purpose and had defined her entire existence, and she had taught her hatred to her students, and her students had taught their students, and the cycle had continued endlessly. But she said watching these three dragons today had broken something inside her, and she realized that her hatred had not brought her family back and had not made the world safer, and had only created more orphans and more grief and more reasons for the next generation to hate. She declared that the dwarf kingdoms would establish sanctuaries and training programs and would work with the humans and elves to build a new relationship with dragons, and that anyone who wanted to continue the old ways of endless killing could leave and found their own kingdom, but they would not drag the future down with the past. The chamber erupted in cheers, and even those who had opposed the idea found themselves swept up in the emotion and the hope and the possibility of something better. And Kara Ironforge embraced Elder Brighthammer and thanked her for her courage and wisdom. That night, they celebrated with a feast, and Storm and Ember and Sky were honored guests, and dwarves, who had never touched a dragon, carefully stroked their scales and fed them treats, and told stories about the family members they had lost, and began the process of healing old wounds. Maya stood beside Lyria and said, this was bigger than any of them had imagined, and that they were witnessing the beginning of a new age, and that future generations would look back on this moment as the turning point when fear began to transform into understanding. Colin added that this was how humans had learned to live with their own predators, and that every civilization eventually reached a point where they had to choose between extinction or evolution, and between isolation or cooperation, and that choosing growth was always harder but infinitely more rewarding. Amy said she would write a book about their journey and document everything they had learned so that other species and other worlds could benefit from their experience, and that knowledge was the greatest gift they could give. because it allowed people to skip past centuries of suffering and arrive directly at wisdom. Over the following months, sanctuaries were established throughout the mountain. Kingdoms and other orphaned dragons were found and raised with the same methods, and each success story created more believers and more advocates, and the movement spread like wildfire across the entire region. Lyria eventually returned to Silverwood, but she traveled constantly between communities, teaching and advising and helping others start their own programs, and she had become a symbol of what one person could accomplish when they refused to abandon their principles and fought for what was right. The three dragons grew into magnificent adults with wingspans as wide as buildings and power that could level mountains, but they remained loyal to their chosen family, and they dedicated their lives to protecting the innocent and teaching others that strength without compassion was worthless, and that true power came from choosing kindness. Years later, when Lyria was old and gray, she would sit with young students and tell them the story of how 3 orphaned hatchlings changed the world, and how 3 human strangers taught her that courage meant protecting the vulnerable, and how together they proved that fear could be overcome, and that different species could build something beautiful when they worked together. She would tell them that the hardest part was not training the dragons, but changing the minds of those who had spent lifetimes believing lies, and that real change happened slowly through patience and demonstration, and refusing to give up even when everyone said it was impossible. And she would end every story the same way by saying that the world was full of creatures who were misunderstood and feared and rejected, and that anyone could be the person who chose compassion over conformity, and that one act of kindness could ripple outward forever and create waves of change that touched countless lives across generations. The 3 dragons would often visit Silverwood, and they would fly with the new generation of trained dragons who had never known a world where they were hunted and feared, and they would look down at the villages where elves and humans and dwarves worked together, and they would know that their mother's death had not been meaningless, and that they had honored her memory by building a better future